All right, I am super excited to share these task formats with everybody today. I have been sorting through all the feedback that people sent into the professional learning survey that I sent out last week. Thank you for taking the time to do that. By far, the most requested thing was help with assessment. So the next couple of weeks, I'll send out some tools. These Friday tools will focus on resources that can help build assessments. And then, just as a side note, I am working on organizing the professional learnings that people said they needed. So, in the next couple of weeks, as I start getting those together and organized and planned, I'll be sending out emails about those. So, on to these assessment tasks. These are a way to incorporate our practices, the science and engineering practices, into our assessments. There's been kind of a shift from just assessing content to also needing to assess what students can do with each of these practices. And that can be pretty tricky. So this document basically lays out all these options for each practice. It gives a bunch of options of how you could assess it. They're good for both formative and summative assessments, and they're actually good for curriculum development too. As you're designing lessons, if there is a practice that you're not quite sure what an activity might look like or what you would do with your students, you can pull some of the task ideas and build them into your lessons or use them as scaffolding as students are learning how to engage with these different practices. On the first page, there are instructions, and it shows how each task is set up. They're all set up the same. So the beginning piece says, this is what you give to students. So most of them will say, provide a phenomenon. A couple of weeks ago, I sent out some resources on using phenomenon with students. And so you could go back and maybe look at those if you're not quite sure what it means when we say give them a phenomenon. But basically, we give students some information, and then we ask students to do something with that information. And so these are all set up that way. We'll look at a couple of them in a minute, but first I wanted to skip down to the bottom because there is an example of an assessment down at the bottom. So this would be more of a summative assessment. And you can see they have actually pulled from two different practices. So on this assessment, they pulled some task format ideas from analyzing and interpreting data and from constructing explanations. And pulling from a couple of different practices is a really great way to make a robust assessment where you can see really how well your students understand the content and how they're able to engage with the practices. So for this one, they have given students some information in the form of pictures and some background information, and then two data sets. And then they have questions based on that are analyzing and interpreting that data. Some of them are really basic tasks. So this task right here would be probably a level 2 task for our secondary students. And that is another nice thing about these is that there are different levels of rigor. So whether you're using proficiency-based learning or not, you can pull some of the less rigorous task ideas and some of the more rigorous task ideas to really see what your students know and what they can do. For some of these later questions or tasks with the analyzing and interpreting data, they do require students to start pulling in their content knowledge and not just reading and not just analyzing the data that was given to them. And then they have two tasks that focus on constructing explanations. And these tasks, for sure, students have to have a good understanding of the core ideas. So as we're developing these assessments and we're focusing a little bit on practice, we don't forget that students still need to show that they understand the core ideas. As an example, I wanted to hop up to the planning and conducting investigations ideas. So I picked these, if I can find them. I picked these very intentionally to use as our example today. Pre-COVID, this was one of the practices that I got the most questions from teachers about. How do I really assess this? There's no way for me to assess 40 students in each class as they're doing an investigation to see how well they're carrying out their investigation. And that is a fair question. And now it's even more relevant because we have students who are learning at home. And so there really isn't a great way to see if they can plan and carry out an investigation. Luckily, we've got this awesome document that has all of these ideas for assessing students in this skill. And when you look through them, most of them do not even have the carrying out the investigation piece, but there's still many of them that are very rigorous. And so even though students may not be using the actual materials, they really have to understand how to both plan and carry out an investigation to complete these tasks. And so we'll look at a couple of them. So we'll look at 6 and 7. So for number 6, we're actually giving them the phenomenon we're trying to figure out. We're giving them the question that we're answering, and we're actually telling them what the investigation is. So we're giving them the investigation. And then they actually have to go through that investigation and figure out what possible confounding variables are there. If a student doesn't understand the content ideas, and if they don't understand what the investigation is going to look like when it is carried out, they're not going to be able to do this, right? They have to have a good understanding of both the investigation plan and what this might look like when we're carrying it out, what might happen to introduce these confounding variables. So that would be one option. And then the next thing we would do is to ask them to write an investigation that addresses those confounding variables. And so this gets really explicitly into that planning piece. Can they plan an investigation in a way that when it is carried out, we are going to be able to address these confounding variables that might be interfering with the data that we're getting? Number 7 is similar in that it requires a lot of understanding of the practice and the content in order for the students to be able to do these tasks, even though they won't actually be planning and carrying out, or they won't actually be doing the investigation. So again, we're going to give them the phenomenon, the question, and the investigation plan, just like in number 6. But in this one, we're also going to be giving them the data that was generated. And they have to evaluate how relevant that data is in answering the question. So this is one where, again, students have to have a pretty good understanding of both the practice and a very good understanding of the content, the core ideas, in order to evaluate how relevant the data is and how well it addresses the question. And the second piece is similar. We're going to ask them to actually revise the plan to make the data more relevant and more accurate and more precise. So students have to have a good understanding of how to plan the investigation, what it would look like as we're carrying it out, what kind of things that they would need to write into their plan so that it could be carried out in a way to get accurate and precise data, and to make sure that the data we're generating is relevant to the question that we're asking. And then I also, at the beginning, I mentioned that these could be used in lesson planning. And so the example that I wanted to look at is actually just the asking questions. So this is one that is easy to tell our students to ask questions, but beyond that, it can be a little bit tricky sometimes to think about, how am I going to build this into my lessons so that students are really learning how to ask scientific questions? And beyond that, what else does this practice entail? Like, what else could I do to get deeper into this practice? So I could pull up this and start looking at all of these different things that could go on a summative assessment, but I could also start building them into my lesson, right? So I could pull some of these and actually start thinking about classroom activities that I could do to engage students in some of these tasks. So hopefully this is helpful in thinking about both writing assessments, but then also engaging students in our classes in the practices. And like I said, in the next couple of weeks, I'll be sending out some other resources. So if you have time to kind of glance through these and familiarize yourself with them, sometime in the next week. And then next Friday, I'll send out another resource that you can use with this one as you're designing assessments.